We are now going to be adding flowers and taking a look at how to customize our branch group template to include flowers on the branches. And what we can do is start out by creating a new layer, and I'm going to call this flowers, and now add in a plane that we're going to move above all of our existing planes. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the material for this and call it flower group. And click OK. Now I already have some flowers that I'm going to be loading in, and these are going to be available in the content folder. We can go ahead and edit our function, and I'm just going to go ahead and load in a little flower cluster that I have, and I'll load in the color first, and then I'm going to load in the alpha for it, and all of our settings that we have should be fine for this. Go ahead and double click on our camera view to open it up, and now what we can do is just place these flower groups, or these flower planes, around this image and render it out. And then we'll be able to have some nice looking flowers on our trees, make it look a little more realistic. We want to make sure we go into those position options since we're going to be scaling them. And we need to move them up on the Z when we make a copy. I'm going to go ahead and move that down and stretch that out just a little. And we can just place this in a couple of different parts. Keep in mind this image map is copied quite a bit throughout a tree, so you really don't want to put too many flowers on it, and you do want to make sure they're spread out pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this flower and paste it, and then we're going to move it up on the Z, and I want to rotate it so it looks a little bit different. We can also go ahead and scale that locally and squish that down. And I'll put a flower on this set over here. And then I'm going to copy and paste, move that over, move it up on the Z, and then we can move that in a little more towards the center and bring that other one to the side. And now we have a little template for flowers. So you could load in any flowers that you want, just these little group clusters, and that will add a lot more to your scenes and make them look a lot more interesting. And we'll go ahead and render out our different images for this, and then load them onto a tree and see how they look. I am also going to select our branches group and hide it from the render and just render out our flowers as their own separate group, and you'll see why once we start working on our tree. So I now have a new scene loaded, just a default scene, and I'm going to load in a plant, and we'll go ahead and load in our rural maple tree because it has a good amount of variation within our leaves, and it'll look pretty good. I will go ahead and open up the plant editor, and I am going to change our flexibility to 200 and click OK, and then go into our leaf material and change this to flower group, and then we're going to edit our function. We'll go ahead and delete our bump map and our bump node, and we'll load in our projected texture map of our flower group that we created, and we'll also load in the clip for that. Make sure we invert it for our transparency, and I'm going to select and just connect our bump directly to our color for now, and click OK. And I'm also going to open up the plant editor once again, select our leaves, and just make sure I change our hooking point back to that branch, and click OK. And we can take a look at a couple of different variations of the tree. And we might want to bring down that green again, unless you want to go and edit the actual color map instead of creating nodes. Sometimes that can be a little easier. Or just modify those leaves, which that color we had created with the green-yellow is a little too intense. So what we can do is add our color node with the HLS shift, color correction, HLS shift, and connect those. And then go ahead and take our luminosity down a little. But another thing we could also do is go to the Effects tab and just decrease our diffusion. So from 60, I can go to 55, bring it down to 50, it'll be even darker. If I bring it down to 10, it'll be extremely dark. So that's another way we can adjust that. That can sometimes be quicker than adding a node. So I'm going to bring that to 55 and click OK. And we'll go into our atmosphere editor, and I'm going to make it a little more towards sunlight, increase our sky dome lighting gain, turn it on ambient occlusion, and we can go to the sun and reposition that. We bring down the pitch, or bring it up to make it a little more daytime, and that should be good. So we'll position our camera a little closer, open up our render options. I'm going to render this to screen with broadcast, and let's go ahead and do 1024 by 576. And now we can see these nice little flowers showing up on our tree. So if you wanted to change the flower type, you could always go back into the template and just change that type of flower or the color. There's really a lot you can do with it. The only problem is, for close-up renders, it's not going to look very realistic because the leaves and the flowers are on the same image, and there's really not a whole lot of depth to it. You can play around with the bump maps to kind of fake the effect, but overall, it's going to look basically the same. It's going to look very flat, and there's really not a whole lot you can do when using the same image. And with an ecosystem, that's basically what you're restricted to, because you cannot use any sort of bump displacement on the plants within view. So if you're just going to have a single plant, or any plants closer to the camera where you need a little bit more detail, where this just isn't enough by using an image map, then we have another method. And what I'm going to do is first Control Copy, so Control C and Control V on the keyboard to copy and paste. And now we have an exact duplicate of this tree. I'm going to go into the leaves and the leaf material for this, and I'm going to call this flower group 2, just so that we have a different material name, because we are going to be making modifications to it. And go to Color and Alpha, edit our function, and now I'm going to load in just those flowers we had rendered. So we have the flower group color, and also its clip or alpha map, which we'll want to invert. I also want to make sure that these aren't in exactly the same place as the other ones. So what I'm going to do is just use our rotate command and just click that once for both of them, and click OK. Now what we could also do is go back to our first version of this tree and remove the flowers entirely from those leaves. But first let's take a look at both variations, our depth variation that we're creating right now, and also the image, because if we have some of the flowers sticking up, it still might create enough realism for a close-up render. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the plant editor for this tree, and we can see all those little flowers showing up. And now what we want to do is make sure these offset, and they're a little bit higher than our leaves that we have right now. And basically all we need to do is adjust the flexibility. We could go ahead and change that to, let's go ahead and change that to 180, and that way it would be just a little bit above, because we don't want them floating either. So just with that little bit of a change, and it looks like I also moved this up a little higher. Another thing we're going to do is take our bark material from our copy, and I'm going to call this Maple Trunk 2, and go to Transparency and give it 100%, and that way it's not going to render and it's not going to show up. We just have our leaves, or actually our flowers in this case. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer, and I'll just reposition our camera a little, and let's take a look at this render. And it looks like there's really still not a lot of variation, so we're going to need to change those flowers just a little bit more. Go to our copy of our maple tree that contains our flowers, open up that flower group. First I'm going to decrease our bump down to 0.2, because now we don't have any other branches or leaves to offset that depth. So we want to make sure we're turning that down just a little. And click OK. Now we're going to open the plant editor, and I am going to decrease our flexibility down to 130, and we can adjust our randomness a little more. And then we could also bring our length and width down -5 on both of them, and we could even adjust the curl. Right now, because our maple trunk has 100% transparency on it, we're currently not seeing the entire plant. So you might want to leave that setting off while you're editing if you really need to see the way the flowers look. But right now I think this should be sufficient. So I'm going to go ahead and render this out again, and we can take a look. And now we can see that definitely looks better, where a lot of our flowers are kind of coming off, and they're not exactly the same direction as our previous flowers, so it does look a little more realistic. But we can go beyond that for even bigger close-ups by creating an object to map our flower to. So let's go ahead and just close this out. And I am going to load in first a sphere. And I want to change our material on this, just so we can see it at first. I'll set it to our default, which is located under rocks. And I'm going to go ahead and squish this down on our z-axis with our size gizmo. And we just want to create a shape for our flower to map onto. And I want to create a little more variation in this, so I'm going to copy and paste the sphere and scale it down and move it up a bit. And then I can stretch that out a little more. We'll go ahead and switch to a different viewport, so we have a little more control over the scale. And I just want to place this in sort of random positions. And we can use the plus and minus keys on our number pad, or next to the backspace on the keyboard, in order to size up and down our gizmo if maybe it's a little bit too small. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this sphere in a couple of different places. Maybe stretch it out a little. Copy and paste. And then we'll add one to the center and bring it up towards the top. And now I'm going to select all of these spheres, go over to the left, and create a Metablob object. We'll go ahead and open up the settings for this. And we can adjust our envelope distance to give more variation, and we just want a little bumpiness. And we can, of course, modify that however you want by adding more spheres. But that should be good. So I'm going to go ahead and I want to right mouse click on this object and bake it to polygons. And our quality is going to be a little bit lower. We don't need a really high polygon amount. And click OK. And now we have a really low poly object. And I'm going to change this name of the object to flowers. And open up our material. I'll go ahead and change that to flowers as well. We're going to set our mapping mode to object parametric. And I'm going to open up the function editor and delete our current nodes, add in a projected texture map, and we're just going to load in those individual flower images. Our first one, set our mapping mode to flat vertical, connect our color to the color output, and add in one more we'll connect our clip to, and select our alpha to the grayscale and our transparency to that grayscale. We can also set our bump to the color and click OK and OK again. And now we're going to see these flowers showing up both on the bottom and the top of this object. And it looks like it's not really covering as much of it as I would like because of the image size. So we can go ahead and increase that image size a little. Go to Edit Function, and now I'm going to take our scale and bring that up to 1.5. Click OK. And now we can see that looks a little bit better. A little more coverage of our object. We could, of course, increase that a little bit more. And we may want to maybe adjust this so it doesn't show up on the top and the bottom. And that's pretty easy to set up. But first, what we want to do is reduce that bump map. So we'll get a bump. I'm going to change this down to 0.2 and click OK. That looks a little bit better. We'll go ahead and render an image of that so we can take a look at how the flowers look at the moment. And it doesn't look too bad. We do see a lot of pixelation, but that is because we are working with a very low resolution object. So I'm going to open up the function editor, select each one of these projected texture maps, and change our interpolation type to bilinear. And that's going to help smooth out those pixels on the edges. And I'll increase our depth of our bump map to 0.3. Go ahead and zoom out just a little so we don't have all that pixelation. And render that. And that doesn't look too bad. What I do want to do is remove that bottom set of flowers because we just want the top of our object. So what I'm going to do is change this to a mixed material. And material number 2, we're going to go ahead and open up, go to our transparency options, and set it to 100%. And now what we can do is close that out, and now we have our mixed material. Go to Influence of Environment, and turn on Distribution of Materials dependent on local slope, altitude, and orientation. And what I'm going to do is turn off our altitude and increase our slope all the way. And we're going to take a look. We can see that's currently not showing up. We're going to go ahead and swap those. And we still do not have a proper blend with our material. And it doesn't look like this method is really going to work for this type of an image and type of an object. We're going to be using this method a little bit later to create some different types of leaves, which will affect both sides of our object. But in this case, there's technically a much simpler way. So what I'm going to do is just delete. I'm going to go ahead and take our materials to mix, swap them so material 1 is available, and change this to a simple material. It'll bring us back to where we were before. If we go up to Effects, we could just turn on one-sided object and click OK. And now that it's going to render correctly, where we just have our leaves or our flowers showing up on top. But now if we take a look from underneath, we are going to see those flowers being rendered, just not from the top. So really this can work out all right, depending on where you're looking at the object. We could customize this a little bit more to remove that bottom area. We could set up an image map. We could also set up another layer. So if you want to do it with that method, instead of using a mixed material, we can add a layer. And I'm going to hit X to create a default layer. And I'm going to increase the transparency to 100. And go to our environment and adjust our altitude range to the bottom part of the surface. But it looks like because of our alpha that we have on the main map, this may not work all the way. I'll go ahead and take a look. And after looking underneath now, it looks like that did remove the bottom part of our object and our surface. So it looks like that is going to work out just fine. I'm going to switch to our scale gizmo and just stretch this up on the Z to give us a little more depth up and down. And now we can go ahead and render that and take a look. And you can modify that object to make it more detailed. If you have access to other modeling programs, or if you currently don't own any other modeling programs, you can use Blender, which is a free modeling program, and either customize the shape in there or create your own custom shape. So there are modeling tools that are available that are quite good. But I'm going to go ahead now, take our flower, and what we can do is save this object out, and we can right mouse click and go to Save Object. And I'm just going to keep this in the scene for now, just in case we need to make modifications. Just move it below the ground plane. I'm going to go into our tree here and select our copy of the maple tree, and we can delete that and go into our original tree, and I'm going to edit these color maps and load in the leaves without flowers. Because now we're going to have our flowers defined by our object. And now I'm going to open our leaf material, and we are going to select Ecosystem, go to our General tab, and add in an object. And now I can select that flower object I just created. And we're going to need to scale this down, so let's bring it at 0.4 to begin with, and hit Populate. Now we can start to see the flowers showing up on our tree. But I'm going to go ahead and scale that down a little bit more. We do 0.2 for smaller flowers, 0.3 for something in between. And then we can adjust the density, how many flowers we'd like to have on our tree. Go ahead and reduce that density. Now the only problem is, with the way ecosystems work, they're populating on the top of the object, which means there's no flowers inside of our object right now. So what we can do is, under the Density tab, I'm going to select Proportional to the Size of Instance from the Offset from Surface, and bring this below our surface. And that'll bring them down a little bit lower. And we're not going to be able to go down too far with them. If you do absolute, now we can define a specific amount and start to get these inside of the tree. So now we have a group of flowers inside of our tree. And now if we want, we can go back to our flower group. And I'm going to select Ecosystem. It's going to add another ecosystem layer where we can add in another object, which is going to be flowers. And I'm going to set our value to 0.3, adjust our density. And this time I'm going to set proportional to the size of instance and move it a little below surface so it's not sticking up too far from our tree. And I'm also going to turn off decay near foreign objects. Hit populate, go to our top ecosystem, turn off decay near foreign objects and populate that. And it looks like we might need to move this one a little bit more below to get it a little more into the tree. We can go to that first group, move that a little more below the surface, and click OK. Now, if some of these flowers are going to end up going outside of our tree, then you might need to bring that in a little bit more, maybe reduce the density. But let's go ahead and take a look at a render of this tree with more three-dimensional flowers on it and see how it looks. And that definitely looks much more realistic, having these objects make up our flowers. But it does look like we're having a little bit of a clipping issue on the bottom with shadows, and that could be caused by the way we're cutting off that object. So sometimes you could also use a Boolean to play around with that, or use some different shapes, and maybe an image map, map it along the side of your sphere to cut off that bottom area. Or like I was saying, if you have access to another program, you could just create that polygon for just your top sphere. I'm going to go back into our surface, and we're going to select that group. It's going below the surface. I'm going to move that up a little bit higher. And we can increase the density. Click OK. And I'm going to render something a little bit larger. Let's go ahead and take a look at our flower-covered tree. And one thing we can notice is that we have a lot of clipping occurring on our leaves. Now this is more than likely caused by the alpha connection that we have within our flowers. So what we can do is go back to our object, which we made sure we saved. And if we open the material for this, making sure we select our flowers, what I want to do is disconnect our alpha and just work with transparency. It's going to give us the same sort of an effect, but it will not affect the clipping of our alpha, and we should be able to correct that problem just by changing that. Really, a lot of that clipping just has to do with the way this specific object is being textured, just because Vue doesn't have a whole lot of modeling capabilities for an object like this. So sometimes you do have to go to an outside program in order to get that to look correct. But if we take a look at where these leaves are being cut, we can tell that's based on the transparency and clipping of each one of these objects. And to get something much more realistic, you can model flowers and have little 3D models of that and create an ecosystem of those on your trees. And that way, for working with individual plants, you'll be able to create something a little more realistic and something with a bit more depth.